Hey, and welcome back to another flip video. Today we're going to be talking about the Holocaust and end of World War II. During World War II, Germany's Nazi government had deliberately murdered like 6 million Jews and 5 million others in Europe, and their actions became known as the Holocaust. Meanwhile, in about 1945, the Allies finally were able to triumph over the Axis powers, but the war left many nations in ruins. The essential questions that we're going to focus on in this video are: what was the Nazi government's final solution? And then how did the war in Europe and the Pacific end? Golden Hawk historians will explain and analyze the sequence of events that led to the Holocaust and the result on Jewish lives, and explain and analyze the different factors that led to the end of World War II in Europe and the Pacific. While you're watching, make sure that you're taking notes in either Cornell or outline format as we've talked about in class. It's okay if you need to pause or rewind the video to make sure that you're taking good notes. At the time of Hitler's rise to Germany, there was approximately 9 million Jews living in Europe, many of whom lived outside of Germany. But Hitler had blamed the Jews for many of Germany's problems before World War II, and he began to promote a belief in the racial superiority of the German people that he called the Aryan race. There was a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe leading all the way back to the Crusades, but Hitler's Germany took it to another level. He passed laws called the Nuremberg Laws that created a separate legal status for Jews living in Germany. Thousands of Jews were either deported, but many left on their own. Many German Jews found themselves without money or property due to the Nuremberg Laws and were therefore unable to immigrate to other countries. As many as 250,000 Jews were trapped inside Germany at the start of World War II. Hitler and the Nazi Germany party adopted a plan that they called the final solution that was used to deliberately mass execute millions of Jews. The first phase of the plan required that all Jews living in Germany be forced into ghettos that were fenced in using barbed wire and walls to prevent the Jews from leaving. They even stationed guards at some of the ghettos to keep them in. Other Jews were sent to concentration camps that were meant to hold the people that Hitler considered enemies of the state. This was more than just Jews. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, Nazis established mobile killing units to kill Jews living in the Soviet Union. They could kill as many as 35,000 Jews in one sitting. Lastly, Jews were sent to execution camps that were designed specifically for the purpose of killing mass numbers of Jews and destroying their bodies. The Nazis didn't want to leave any evidence of their crime. At concentration camps, Jews were subjected to harsh working conditions or even used in cruel medical experiments. Many of the Jews that were in concentration camps died of starvation. But Jews were not the only group in the final solution. The other groups that were included were the Poles or Polish people, Slavs, homosexuals, people with disabilities, both intellectual and physical, and Roma gypsies. Approximately 5 million people, other than Jews, were killed during the Holocaust. Jews, however, suffered the most, resulting in 6 million deaths. The mass murder of Jews is known today as the Holocaust. Other countries were aware of the Nazis' anti-Semitism in the 1930s, but the full extent of Hitler's crimes was not seen by the outside world. By 1942, the United States and other countries had started hearing really disturbing reports of widespread killing of Jews in Europe. The United States and Great Britain met to talk about it, but there was no decisions made. They were mainly unwilling to do much due to the fear of interrupting the war effort. But as the war began to end, the United States and Soviet troops began to find the concentration and the death camps, and the scenes of horror made the evidence clear of what the Nazis had done. By the end of the war in Europe, the Axis powers had suffered about 2 million casualties and were outnumbered and unable to stop the Allied advance. The Soviets were able to end the siege of Leningrad and started driving the Axis German forces out of the Soviet Union and back into Central Europe. As the Soviets forced the Axis armies back toward Germany, the other Allies were finalizing their plans for a massive invasion of Western Europe. On June 6, 1944, American General George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower led the Allied forces into an invasion of Germany along the beaches of Normandy, France. This became known as the D-Day invasion. The casualties on the beach were high as the American and British troops entered the Normandy beaches due to the German fortresses that were built along the cliffs of Normandy. But D-Day was a huge victory for the Allies. They were able to push the German forces back and gain an entry point that allowed the Allied troops to begin pouring into France. The Allied forces were able to break through the German defenses by July, and by the end of August, they surrendered Paris and were pushing them back into Germany. In December of 1944, Hitler ordered one last massive counterattack in Belgium. And at first, the Germans had made a solid advance, producing a bulge in the Allied battle lines. The battle then became known as the Battle of the Bulge. By January 1945, the Allies had crushed the German offensive at the Battle of Bulge, and the Germany's defeat marked the end of major German resistance. From here on out, it pretty much be smooth sailing back to Germany. 3 Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in Yalta to plan the end of the war and the peace to follow. And they called this the Yalta Conference, and they agreed to 3 things. 1, they were going to divide Germany into 4 sections, occupied by either France, the United States, the Soviet Union, or Great Britain. The second thing was that the Soviets would take over the Eastern European countries and ensure that they would establish democracies. This might be pretty hard to do since the Soviet Union was communist. The Soviet Union would declare war on Japan also to help the United States in the war in the Pacific. By the end of 1945, the Soviet and American troops had advanced effortlessly to Berlin. Hitler was found dead on May 2, 1945, because he'd killed himself, and he was found by Soviet troops shortly after Berlin surrendered. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, and this day became known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Although the Allies had achieved victory in Europe, this war was still going on in the Pacific. By mid-1945, American bombers had started regularly bombing Japanese cities. In February of 1945, Allied troops landed on the Japanese island of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans died, but they were able to successfully capture the tiny island. All but 1,000 Japanese died to protect the island. After Iwo Jima, the Americans invaded Okinawa, barely 350 miles from Japan. The island hopping was getting super close. At the Battle of Okinawa, the Americans lost nearly 12,000 lives, but the island was claimed for the Americans. They were nearly on their way to capturing the mainland Japan. After Okinawa, the Allies sought to take the island of Japan itself, but they had lost so many troops at Iwo Jima and Okinawa that they didn't want to attempt a land invasion. They thought it would be too costly. Estimates had them at nearly 1 million people died. American leaders had been developing an atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project in the United States and had hoped that that weapon would be able to bring the war to a quick halt. On July 26, 1945, the Allies issued a demand for Japanese surrender, but when the Japanese refused, the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. But the Japanese didn't surrender. On August 9, 1945, the Allies dropped the second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. And finally, 5 days later, the Japanese surrendered on August 15, 1945, on what became known as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day. At the end of the war, much of the world lay in ruins and millions of people had died. Entire cities, villages, and farms had been destroyed. Food, shelter, and medicine were scarce, and there was millions of displaced people in Europe and Asia due to being prisoners of war, survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, or just people who had fled their homes during the war. Many people returned home to find that their homes were completely gone. Roosevelt had convinced Stalin to agree to join a new world organization proposed by the Allies called the United Nations. The United Nations was designed to encourage international cooperation and prevent war. The United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China formed the UN Security Council. The UN issued the Declaration of Human Rights that stated that all humans have equal and inalienable rights. At the Nuremberg trials for Nazi and military officials between 1945 and 1949, several dozen Nazi leaders were sentenced to death for their roles in the Holocaust and in other war crimes. The Allied leaders continued their work at the Yalta Conference at Potsdam in Germany called the Potsdam Conference. However, at this conference, America started to become concerned about the growing influence of communism from the Soviet Union and their different aspirations for their newly gained territory in Eastern Europe. The Allies wanted to make sure that Stalin would live up to his promises, primarily the ones dealing with Eastern Europe and democracy from Yalta. However, they would be surely surprised. Make sure that you read back over your notes and you have all the necessary vocabulary. Thanks for joining me for this video, and I'll see you in class.